All right, so we're diving deep today into indigenous rights in Colombia. We've got this pretty hefty report to guide us, the Indigenous Navigator National Survey Compendium, Colombia.
A mouthful for sure.
Yeah, it is, right? Published by the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs,
IWGIA?
IWGIA. There you go. So
No.
basically what we're trying to do here is help you navigate this whole complex situation with indigenous rights in Colombia, get beyond just, the headlines and the sound bites.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how this report kind of lays bare this tension, I guess, between Colombia's, really progressive legal framework and then the reality for indigenous peoples on the ground.
It's almost like, you think about it, 115 distinct indigenous peoples, a constitution that says, hey, we're multi-ethnic, we're pluricultural, they've signed all these international treaties. You'd think they'd be like the gold standard,
You
right,
would think.
for protecting indigenous rights.
You would think. But then the report kind of paints this different picture. It really shows this consistent gap between what's on paper and what's actually happening. Like the UN, for example, they've been flagging this for years. All these observations, recommendations, going all the way back to 2008, right through to 2023, specifically saying, Colombia, you need to do better on indigenous rights.
So clearly there's a disconnect. But
Yeah.
before we kind of dive into the nitty-gritty, can you help us understand what self-determination actually means, like in this context?
Hmm.
Because it's a word that gets thrown around a lot. But what does it actually look like on the ground for indigenous peoples in Colombia?
Yeah, and the report does a really good job of breaking this down. It's not just some abstract idea. It's about indigenous communities having genuine control over their lives, their territories, their futures, right? Like, for example, they talk about these 11 indigenous territorial entities that are in different stages of being, officially recognized. And some of these entities, they function with a lot of autonomy, almost like independent nations within Colombia.
Wow. Independent nations, that's fascinating. Are there any specific examples that come to mind that would illustrate this?
Oh, absolutely. Like, think about the Arhuaco people up in the Sierra Nevada, the Santa Marta Mountains.
Hmm.
They've maintained their traditional governance structures, for centuries. They've got this spiritual leader called the Memo, and they manage their territory according to their own laws and customs, making decisions about, resource use, conflict resolution, even things like education.
So it's a really unique and resilient system.
It is, yeah.
But I'm guessing there are also challenges to this autonomy, right? Because it's hard to imagine these communities existing in a bubble, totally insulated from external pressures.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The report doesn't sugarcoat that. Like, even in a place like the Sierra Nevada, the Arhuaco, they're facing pressures from tourism, from mining interests, even the drug trade. And sadly, that's a pretty common theme across a lot of indigenous territories in Colombia.
It makes sense. So how does this whole idea of self-determination connect to the land itself? Because it seems like there's this really strong link between, indigenous identity and territory in Colombia.
Yeah, and that connection is fundamental. The report highlights that there are over 885 formalized collective territories, they call them resguardos, covering something like 30 million hectares, which is massive. And legally, these resguardos are incredibly well protected. Like the Constitution says, they're inalienable, imprescriptible, and inembargable. You can't sell them, transfer them, seize them.
Hmm. Wow, that's impressive. It sounds like they've got this really solid legal framework backing up their right to the land. But then if that's the case, what are the threats? What's the other side of the story here?
Well, and that's where you see this tension that I mentioned, between the legal protections and the reality on the ground. And the report really delves into that, revealing all these kind of interconnected challenges.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. So let's unpack those challenges. What are some of the specific things that jumped out at you from the report? What are some of the biggest threats that these communities are facing? So when we talk about threats to indigenous communities in Colombia, it's more than just a list, right? I mean, the report really digs deeper. What for you stood out as the most urgent issue?
One thing that really hit me was how interconnected all these challenges are. It's not just about, land rights or preserving culture. It all ties into the environment and, tragically, the ongoing armed conflict in Colombia.
Yeah, you can't really separate indigenous rights from the bigger picture of violence and instability.
Right. And the scary part is how indigenous territories are often caught in the crossfire, literally becoming battlegrounds. The report has this really sad example of the Nukak people. They live this nomadic life in the Amazon rainforest, and they've been forced out of their traditional areas because of the fighting. It's affecting their health, their culture, their whole way of life. It's heartbreaking.
It's one thing to see statistics about violence, but when you hear about a specific community, like the Nukak, it makes it so real.
Yeah.
You really see the human cost of conflict.
That's what this report does so well. It goes beyond the numbers and connects them to actual people and communities. And that displacement, it's not just about being physically uprooted. It sets off a whole chain reaction that impacts every part of their lives.
Can you say more about that?
Hmm?
What are some of those less obvious impacts of displacement that the report talks about?
Imagine being forced to leave your ancestral land, the place your people have lived for generations. You're suddenly cut off from your food, your medicine, your sacred places, your whole support network. The report explains how this can lead to real psychological trauma, cultural breakdown, even a loss of traditional knowledge. It's tough to adapt to a totally new environment.
It's like ripping a tree out of the ground, right? It's not just about losing a location, it's about losing a way of life, that connection to history, to identity. How do these communities even begin to rebuild after something that disruptive?
That's a big question the report tackles, and there's no easy answer. It emphasizes that going back to their land, even if that's possible, isn't enough. They need to deal with the deep wounds from the violence and displacement, rebuild social structures, revitalize cultural practices that might have been lost or weakened.
Sounds like a huge and very long-term undertaking. Does the report offer any suggestions for practical steps to support these communities?
It stresses the need for a holistic approach. For
Right.
example, healthcare that's sensitive to their culture and deals with both physical and psychological trauma. Economic development initiatives that are tailored to their specific needs so they can rebuild their lives while respecting their values and traditions.
So not just aid, but empowerment.
Right. It's about the communities themselves taking control of their recovery. The report is super clear on that. Consult with Indigenous leaders, respect their knowledge, make sure they have a real voice in the policies that affect them.
It makes sense solutions imposed from outside are unlikely to work in the long run.
Exactly. And this leads to a bigger point, how to fix the underlying issues that created this whole mess in the first place.
The report doesn't shy away from the need for systemic change. Okay, now I'm really curious. What are some of the key recommendations they make for real, lasting change, for truly protecting indigenous rights in Colombia?
Systemic change, huh? That sounds like a pretty big task. What does that even mean when we're talking about indigenous rights in Colombia? Like, where do you even start with something that massive?
Well, yeah, it's not a quick fix, that's for sure. But the good thing about this report is that it kind of gives you a roadmap. It points out specific areas where things need to change. And, one of the most important things is making sure existing laws are actually being followed. We talked about how strong the protections are for indigenous land rights in the Constitution. But the problem often isn't the laws themselves. It's that, they're not being enforced.
Yeah. It's one thing to have good laws written down, but it's a whole other thing to make sure people are actually following them. So how do you bridge that gap? Well, the report really pushes for more accountability, like holding government agencies and companies responsible when they don't respect indigenous rights, and also making sure that indigenous communities themselves have a say in how things are monitored and enforced.
Giving them a seat at the table, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And then beyond just enforcing the laws, the report also says there need to be some changes to the legal system itself to make things fairer for indigenous people. Like, they talk about reforms to the justice system to make sure indigenous people have equal access, having good legal representation, making sure the courts are culturally sensitive, and dealing with language barriers.
That's huge. You can't really have justice if you're not taking those unique challenges into account.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, how all these things, we talked about legal reforms, environmental protection, conflict resolution, they're all so connected, aren't they?
Yeah, and the report picks up on that too. That's why they also recommend investing in peace building and conflict resolution that gets to the root causes of the violence in indigenous territories. You have to tackle things like poverty, inequality, discrimination. Those are often the things that lead to conflict in the first place.
It's like a multi-layered approach,
Yeah.
right? Dealing with the immediate problems, but also trying to prevent them from happening again. I'm wondering, though, does the report mention any specific examples of like initiatives that are already working, making a positive difference.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And those are the stories that really give you hope. Like, for example, they highlight the work of OPIS, the National Organization of Indigenous Peoples of the Colombian Amazon. They've done a lot to get indigenous land rights recognized. They've been promoting sustainable development projects, and they've been really leading the charge on protecting the Amazon rainforest from things like deforestation.
That's amazing. It shows that indigenous communities aren't just victims, they're actively fighting for their rights, for their future. Anything else that stood out to you?
Yeah, they also talk about all these incredible indigenous women leaders who are doing so much for peace building and development. They're often the ones mediating conflicts, advocating for social justice, keeping their cultural traditions alive. Their stories are really inspiring, how strong and resilient they are.
It's a good reminder that it's important to listen to those diverse voices within indigenous communities. It's not just one big group. There are so many individuals and organizations doing really important work.
Exactly. And that brings us to, a question for you, the listener. What can you do to support indigenous rights in Colombia? It might seem like it's far away, but there are things you can do to help.
It can feel a bit overwhelming, to be honest, all these big challenges, but even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. First of all, just staying informed is huge. You're already doing that by listening to this deep dive. There are also groups like IWGIA that provide updates and information on indigenous rights in Colombia and globally.
So educate yourself, stay informed. What else can people do?
Supporting indigenous-led organizations is another big one. There are tons of grassroots groups working hard to protect indigenous rights and promote sustainable development. Even a small donation can go a long way.
And what about spreading awareness, like in your own community?
That's really important too. Talk to your friends and family about these issues. Share information on social media. You can even contact your elected officials and tell them you support policies that protect indigenous rights. It all helps amplify those voices and push for change.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we can all play a part in creating a more just world. So as we're wrapping up here, what's the main takeaway you want to leave our listener with? What should they remember from this deep dive into indigenous rights in Colombia?
For me, the biggest thing is that indigenous rights aren't just some abstract concept. They're about real people, real communities, real lives. These are people facing huge challenges, but they're also showing incredible resilience and determination in their fight for a better future. It's definitely a call to action. We're all connected. And respecting indigenous rights is not just about doing what's right, it's about building a better world for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So to our listener, we encourage you to stay engaged, stay informed, and keep exploring these issues. The future we create is a collective effort, and every voice, every action counts.